Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. I'm Kris. This is not requested. Kings and Generals, Seminoles, Native Americans who never surrendered video.
In December of 2006, Hard Rock Inc., a massive international chain of restaurants, hotels and casinos, was bought out for $965 million. The buyers? The Seminole tribe of Florida. At a press conference, tribal representative Max Osceola Jr. remarked on the purchase pithily, "Our ancestors sold Manhattan for trinkets. Today we begin to buy it back, one hamburger at a time." This development represented a big stride for Native American visibility and autonomy in the modern world. But in truth, the boldness of the Seminoles is nothing new and goes back centuries. In this video, we will tell the story of a brave people who for decades fought against the American advance, becoming the only native tribe to have never surrendered to the United States government. This video was sponsored by World of Tanks. In this free-to-play team-based game, players take command of the most iconic military vehicles from the mid-20th century. 7 days of World of Tanks premium account, 1 garage slot, and 100% crew, Tiger 131 and Sherman VC Firefly tanks for rent for 10 battles each. See you on the battlefield.
I won't be there.
To discover the origins of the Seminoles, we must begin in the territory that is now the states of Georgia and Alabama. In the 18th century, this region was home to a loose confederacy of indigenous communities, known today as the Muscogee-speaking Creek peoples, who at the time were a people in transition. As a result of contact with white settlers, chieftains had begun convincing their people to abandon their old way of life and adopt the European ways. A handful of Creek elites managed to acquire some African slaves and worked them on Indian-owned cotton plantations. While slavery was not a new concept in many Native American communities, permanent chattel slavery based upon skin color and race was definitely something adopted from European practices. Disturbed by what they saw as a total uprooting of their culture and traditions, many Creeks migrated southwards to Florida, aiming to create a new home for themselves away from the perceived corruption of the white man. They were joined by members of other tribes suffering similar social turmoil, as well as a large number of African slaves escaping from both Indian and white servitude. Once home to many powerful indigenous chiefdoms, Florida now stood almost entirely depopulated, following a devastating bout of Old World diseases brought upon them by Spanish explorers in the 1500s. As a result, the Creek refugees and their allies settled the territory with ease. By 1775, this motley band had developed a new identity of their own. The Spanish, who loosely controlled Florida at the time, called these newcomers Cimarron, meaning wild ones or runaways. Over time, this word became corrupted into Seminole. As can be expected, Seminole culture was very similar to the society of their parent tribe, the Muscogee Creeks. Like the Creeks, the Seminoles lived in small, sedentary villages. Their men were primarily hunters, while their women were farmers, cultivating corn, beans, and squash. Despite these similarities, the Seminole lifestyle evolved in unique ways to suit Florida's climate. Rather than the wattle and daub houses of their Creek ancestors, the Seminoles lived mainly in open-air stilt homes called chickee, built to be suspended over the unstable wetlands upon which their villages lay. Additionally, while their hunters' quarry included more traditional game, like deer and turkey, they also chased more exotic creatures like alligators. Like most southeastern Native Americans, Seminoles were the descendants of the old Mississippian peoples, a once great culture that had flourished in large cities like Cahokia centuries before the arrival of the Europeans.
Cahokia is in southern Illinois. It's 10 miles away from St. Louis, and I have a trip planned to go see there. There's 120 mounds, earthen mounds. There's only 80 remaining. I think the largest one is still around, and it's the chief. But from the top of his mountain, no one was allowed to go up to the chief's mountain, except, you know, certain security and stuff like that. But from the top of the chief's mound, you can look over and see the arch in St. Louis. So I think that's going to be really cool to be able to go to. I got it mentally booked for November.
Disease brought upon them by Europeans had brought an end to this classical American civilization, but its ancient cults lived on through its descendants. Suffice to say, it is impossible to cover over 1,000 years of complex religion, so we will summarize by saying that Seminole spirituality centered around the bravery of warriors, the veneration of supernatural beings that inhabited the cosmos, and the celebration of the annual corn harvest. Despite being
How does this weird stone bath mat help prevent slips?
Do you hate stepping out of the shower into a puddle of filthy bacteria? Soggy bath mats aren't just road.
I love it. I want to do more of it.
Despite being initially apprehensive towards European ways, the Seminoles were very eager to do business with European merchants. From British, Spanish, and French traders, they acquired iron tools, cloth, and most importantly, muskets, a weapon that quickly replaced bows and spears. Eventually, they also began ranching European cattle and farming European crops. However, Europeans were not the only source of cultural influence on the Seminoles. The Seminole lands were a haven for black freedom, in a continent otherwise insistent on keeping African peoples under the master's whip. Slaves that escaped into Seminole lands were accepted by the local chiefs, who allowed them to form their own autonomous villages, amass wealth in livestock and crops, and bear arms to protect themselves. In exchange, these freedmen would pay an annual tribute to the Seminole chieftains and fight alongside them in war. This resulted in a fascinating and vibrant Afro-Seminole people who dressed and ate much like the native Seminoles did, but whose culture was a dynamic blending of African, Native American, and syncretic Christian traditions. Now that we have painted a summary picture of the Seminole world, let us talk about the wars for which they are best known. Wars that would in time become the longest and most costly conflict fought by the United States against any Native American people throughout the nation's entire history. We begin back in Creek Territory, Alabama, where in 1811, the Shawnee war leader Tecumseh had galvanized a faction of Creeks to rise up against their Europeanized chieftains and American overlords. This faction, known as the Red Sticks, waged a bloody anti-colonial revolt until 1814, when they were crushed by a US army led by Major General Andrew Jackson.
He went after them because of the Fort Mims disaster, which I want to say there was it was less than 1,000 people, maybe, and they massacred all but 11 because those 11 escaped, or maybe it was 8 or 11. I mean, you know, they wiped out virtually all of them. Andrew Jackson found out, was none too happy, and went down and gradually just chased them all until the leader, I think his last name was Weathersford. He was half native, half American. He was the leader of this Red Sticks. He went to Jackson's camp and basically surrendered. And he said that Jackson had basically killed, like, not Jackson himself, but the military going after them had basically wiped out his people. He was the only one left, killed his family and everything. It was a sad story. And Jackson told him, I should have you killed, but because you came and surrendered, I'm going to let you live. And oddly enough, those two ended up forming a friendship, and they wrote each other. But I don't know whatever happened. Was it John Weathersford? Anyways, they stayed in communication for a little bit until one of them died first. I don't remember who.
Punishment for the insurrection, Jackson forced the Creek Nation to give over 21 million acres of their land to the US. Many surviving Red Sticks fled south, seeking refuge among the Seminoles, who welcomed them with open arms. The act of harboring Red Sticks, and the fact that the Seminoles had supported the British during the War of 1812 by raiding American settlements, and consistently fought off any attempts made by colonial and Creek militias to recapture escaped slaves, ired the US government. In 1815, a community of former slaves had occupied an abandoned British fort on Prospect Bluffs under the suzerainty of Seminole chieftains. This so-called Negro Fort quickly became a militant sanctuary for escaped slaves across the South, and it proved to be the last straw for the United States. The First Seminole War began in the summer of 1816, when Brigadier General Edmund P Gaines launched an expedition into Seminole territory at the head of about 100 US regulars and 150 Allied Creek warriors.
Edmund P Gaines, Gaines. If you don't know who he is, look him up. The man, he's the one who captured Aaron Burr after Aaron Burr had he killed, what's your name? Alexander Hamilton, that's his name. That gentleman right there. Edmund P Gaines didn't, Aaron Burr did. And then Aaron Burr turned a little traitor. And so Edmund P Gaines, who served under William Henry Harrison, I think at the Battle of Tippecanoe, he served under him for a little bit, but Gaines was brutal. Went in one battle, was telling came up on a couple guys who weren't fighting, they were scared, and he told them they better fight. And they were surrounded by natives, whooping, hollering, gunshots, and he went looking for somebody. He went in this tent, soldier's tent. I think he was looking for the doctor, maybe going to get help. These guys just stood there frozen. Gaines walks in the tent, and 3 natives run around and run in the tent, and there's a gunshot that goes off, and these guys are just like, oh my gosh, we're listening to the sound of the second in command being murdered. A couple minutes of a scuffle, and Gaines comes out holding one of them by the throat. He's been shot in the arm, he'd been tomahawked, and he just choked the last guy to death. He killed the other 2 in the tent. It was several minutes gone by, and these guys they're just watching. And then Gaines comes walking past them and says something like, "Fight, damn it, fight!" And then went off to find the doctor, because now he also needed to be treated. Gaines was a beast. Side note, sorry.
With their initial goal being the conquest of Negro Fort. The Black Warriors rose bravely up to the challenge, flying a red flag above their walls, indicating that they would give no quarter. Despite their brave struggle, a US gunboat positioned on the nearby Apalachicola River struck the fort's main gunpowder magazine, triggering a massive explosion that killed almost all 330 of the defenders. Utterly enraged African and Amerindian Seminoles retaliated with aggressive raids on American border towns in Georgia. Meanwhile, Gaines's expedition continued westwards, attacking and destroying a Seminole settlement known as Foultown in November of 1817. Retaliating in force, Seminole warriors under one chief Homathlimiko ambushed a US Navy boat on the Apalachicola River. 40 American citizens, including women and children, were gruesomely tortured and executed. This massacre sparked outrage in Washington, and as a result...
Fort Mims. This is where Andrew Jackson basically lost his mind.
Andrew Jackson was sent to quell the growing Indian problem. At the head of 500 Army regulars, 1,000 Dixieland militiamen, and 2,000 Creek warriors, Jackson launched a renewed punitive strike into Seminole lands. His first move was to build a new outpost, Fort Gadsden. He then proceeded deep into native territory, leaving a path of fire in his wake. The Seminoles offered fierce resistance, but were simply outnumbered and outgunned. After a brief detour to seize the Spanish-held Fort San Marcos as a base of operations, Jackson managed to lure 2 Seminole chieftains onto a ship flying fake British colours. They were executed without trial, along with 2 British traders who had been selling them weapons. After this, Jackson proceeded down the Suwannee River, burning every major settlement along its shores.
Those 2 British soldiers, I believe something was said to the effect of, now I'm wondering if it was Spanish. Anyways, so he had threatened to execute them for what they did, and the British had said that he had no right to be in there, and he had no right to arrest them. You know, that was it. Florida at the time was Spain. It was an independent country, and he was like, he didn't care. And so he wrote a letter basically telling them that this is what they had to do, or else he was going to kill them, and and then he included a PS: the traitors were killed this morning, or like hung this morning, or executed this morning. And it was pretty much a, yeah, well, it doesn't, I'm telling you this, but it's too late anyways. It was a brutal letter.
All organized resistance was
It was a brutal letter. Let me say that again.
soon stamped out, and the Seminoles were forced to abandon northern Florida, dispersing into the central and southern swamplands. Jackson declared victory and sent most of his army back to their homes, ending the First Seminole War. Jackson's escapades had angered Britain, whose citizens he'd executed, and Spain, who technically still owned Florida, but neither country could really do anything about it. In 1819, Spain gloomily accepted the inevitable and just sold Florida to Washington for $5 million. The Americans were now free to ramp up their war efforts against the Seminoles. Recognizing this,
why don't more people know about this free health insurance program? You can qualify for $0 health insurance that covers free doctor visits, free dental.
I just want to pause real fast and just say this. I get a lot of people saying that, you know, Americans stole land, and yes, we did to a certain point. But also know this. France sold a big chunk of land that you could say didn't belong to them. But we don't hear that. We hear how we're bad for that. Spain sold us Florida. But you don't hear that. You hear how we're terrible because we took it. Yeah, we bought some land from Mexico, kind of stole some land from them. But a lot of the land was bought and sold in this country. But we're the terrible ones because we're here. There's a lot of countries involved in this, and a lot of stealing and pillaging. So I just hate to hear the it's my fault, it's my fault. I had nothing to do with it myself, but there was a lot of countries guilty. It's not just us. It's not just the U.S.
Recognizing this, most Seminole chieftains sued for peace in 1823, signing the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, which shrunk their territory down to a reservation in the inland swamps of central Florida. However, as Seminoles continued to treat white settlers with bitterness and continued to harbor escaped slaves, tensions grew once more. In 1830, Andrew Jackson was elected President of the United States. One of his first initiatives was to get Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act, a piece of legislation that mandated the expulsion of all Native Americans in the eastern United States to a designated Indian Territory west of the Mississippi.
So, I'm going to bring this up, and I'm not taking sides in any of this, but this is another thing I'm pointing out. In Andrew Jackson's lifetime, he was born in Waxhaw, South Carolina. Yeah. His family fought natives on the frontier. He moved to Tennessee, had to deal with things like that. With this, he had to deal with them. So he didn't have a very good perception of them. right or wrong. I say this to go back into history. When you look at all the skirmishes that happened from the landing at Plymouth up until was it 1756 to 63, the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War. The native and the French sided with each other against the colonies, the U.S., and the British. Then, in 76 to 83, the natives sided with the British. Some natives sided with the Americans in the war. And then you have the War of 1812. You have skirmishes leading up. The War of 1812, where you have natives siding with the British, some natives siding with the Americans. The overall theme, though, is always native versus American. For, I'm sure, the fact that we were here, you could say, is that. But if you're looking at it from that aspect, you could kind of understand why someone like Jackson's going to come around and say, I can't trust them because they're not on our side. The vast majority is not on our side. Get rid of them. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying you got to put yourself in their situation. You can look at it now and say it's terrible what happened. Yes, it is. But put yourself in the situation back then and try to look at it from that standpoint. It's going to be completely different. Much like it would be completely different in 400 years if we don't have gas cars and people are looking back in history going, oh my gosh, look what they did. Can you believe that? They didn't have flying electric cars like us. Like, you know, it's easy to look back and say they're terrible because, but you got to try to put yourself in the eyes of the people who did those things, right or wrong. And again, I'm not siding with either. I'm just saying you gotta understand. And of course, from the other side, we showed up and we just kept coming. So you have to understand why they didn't like that.
A policy that would lead to the infamous Trail of Tears. The plan was to move the Seminoles out to Arkansas Territory, where they would be settled in the same reservation as the Creeks, since the US government did not see a difference between the two tribes. Naturally, the overwhelming majority of Seminoles were deeply opposed to not only having to leave their homes, but having to live with their ancestral Creek enemies. When 7 Seminole chieftains were invited out to Arkansas to survey their prospective new lands in 1832, the majority of them declared that they would keep their people in Florida. However, 2 chieftains did submit and signed the Treaty of Fort Payne. Operating in utter bad faith, US officials claimed that per this treaty, all Seminoles were now bound to move west, despite the majority of them having never agreed to do so. The Senate ratified
That's garbage. That's a garbage one.
The document in 1834, giving the Seminoles an ultimatum to vacate Florida within the year or be removed by force. One Seminole leader particularly enraged by this was a chieftain named Osceola, who quickly began rallying other chieftains in preparation for the battles to come. Osceola was a fascinating man. He had actually formed a dysfunctional friendship with one Wiley Thompson, the US federal agent who had been put in charge of deporting Osceola's people. At one point, Thompson had even given Osceola a rifle as a sign of respect, even though it was against US policy to arm Indians. This was a fatal misjudgment of character, for on December 28, 1835, the Seminole chieftain assassinated Thompson outside Fort King using that very same gun. Later that night, a column of 110 US soldiers, led by Major Francis L. Dade, was ambushed by a Seminole raiding party led by Chiefs McCanopy and Jumper. All but 2 of them were massacred. The Second Seminole War had begun. It would take 7 years and many campaigns for the United States to end the war. Entrenched thick in deep, inaccessible swamps in the interior of Florida, the stubborn Seminoles proved an incredibly tough nut to crack. Their main force of warriors were based out of their lake stronghold on the Withlacoochee River, known as the Cove of the Withlacoochee, a nearly impenetrable natural location protected by thick swamps and seasonal floodwaters. American attempts to draw the Seminole out of their den and into open battle proved utterly fruitless. Knowing they were heavily outnumbered, the native warriors simply retreated into the deep swamps whenever a US army of significant size approached, knowing the dense marshy terrain made tracking them nearly impossible. The master guerrilla fighters struck quickly, attacking isolated platoons and supply convoys before disappearing effortlessly back into the misty longleaf pines as quickly as they had appeared. Various US commanders did find some success, but they were never able to pull the Seminoles out of their homeland by the very roots. Things looked increasingly bleak for the Americans when the Seminoles launched a spree of aggressive raids in the summer of 1836, attacking homesteads and plantations across Florida. To make matters worse, disease had also begun to spread in the US ranks, resulting in one of their staging points, Fort Drane, being abandoned in July. It would only be when Major General Thomas Jessup was put in charge of the war in December 1836 that the tides began to turn. Jessup realized that to beat the Seminoles, you had to fight like the Seminoles. Jessup split his 9,000-strong army into small raiding parties, and instead of going after the main native stronghold, focused on his own ruthless brand of Fabian warfare, targeting Seminole villages, stealing their cattle, and harassing their women and children, all to wear down the resolve of their warriors. This plan worked.
For just $67, you can make as many videos as you want, and you never need to pick up a camera or use any fancy editing software.
Cool.
This plan worked, and by March of 1837, 700 Seminole warriors had surrendered to the US garrison at Fort Brooke, where they were put in holding cells pending their deportation west. Despite this, the light of Seminole resistance had not been entirely extinguished. In June, Chief Osceola fought his way into the poorly garrisoned Fort Brooke with 200 warriors by his side. He convinced the interned warriors not to give up the fight and led them back into the swamps to continue the war anew. Jessup resolved to neutralize his Osceola problem by playing dirty. He invited the Seminole chieftain to a peace summit at Fort Peyton under a flag of truce. This proved to be a ruse, and as soon as he arrived, Osceola was attacked and imprisoned. Jessup's act of treachery sent shockwaves throughout the American public, who had come to admire Osceola as an honorable and valiant foe. Both Congress and the national press decried Jessup's tactics. To this day, some historians still refer to Jessup's deception as one of the most disgraceful acts in American military history. Osceola decayed in captivity, developing a sickness, and died 3 months later. His American foes afforded him a proper burial at Fort Moultrie with military honors. Fighting continued throughout 1838 and 1839, but by then, the writing was very much on the wall. In 1841, Colonel William J. Worth was able to finally drive the Seminoles out of the Cove of the Withlacoochee. Over 4,000 Seminoles put down their arms and submitted to US authority, allowing themselves to be deported to Indian Territory out west. What few remained in Florida, a paltry 300 or so souls, were relegated to the Everglades, the southernmost tip of the peninsula. By 1841, large-scale fighting had more or less ended, and the Second Seminole War was over. One would think that with their population reduced, the remaining Seminoles in Florida would be done with war and resigned to relocation, but the spirit of defiance had not yet been broken. In 1845, Florida achieved statehood, and as a result, the United States ramped up its efforts in removing every last Seminole out of its borders for good. By 1850, the federal government offered a monetary bribe to every individual Seminole who agreed to move to Indian Territory out west, $450 per woman and $800 per man. This proved largely ineffective, and by 1852, only 100 or so had agreed to depart. War was once more inevitable and began again in 1855. This time the resistance was led by a chieftain known as Halpuda Miko, meaning alligator chief, although he was better known by his English name, Billy Bowlegs. Bowlegs was determined, but with only a tiny handful of warriors at his command, all he could really do was commit petty raids on small estates, picking off isolated farmers and fishermen. In 1856, Brigadier General William S. Harney was put in charge of the situation. He built a chain of fortified outposts across central Florida, and from them sent patrols to scour deep into the Everglades for any Seminoles. However, Bowlegs and his fighters were like ghosts, having slipped into the deepest, most isolated of swampy quagmires. No patrol was ever able to catch them, although the Americans burned down Seminole villages and croplands, which the natives had been forced to abandon in their retreat. Despite this, no surrender came. The federal government resorted to bribery once more. This time, they promised the Seminoles the original monetary compensation, as well as a reservation separate from the Creeks. These terms were agreeable to most of the remaining Seminoles, and in 1858, Bowlegs and some 160 of his people finally put down their arms and agreed to go west. Despite this, there remained some 100 Seminoles in Florida, 100 souls who never agreed to give up their land, who never signed a peace treaty, who never surrendered. After the Third Seminole War, the US government was aware of these last remnants, but with so few Seminoles left in the state, they adopted a new policy that basically amounted to whatever man, and let the matter rest. Today, the Seminoles are a people alive and well. A total of 16,000 of them live in Oklahoma, the descendants of those deported during the wars. Those who remained in Florida eventually gained legal recognition from the United States government in 1957. Today they number 4,000 strong, known as indigenous pioneers of trade and business. The story of the Seminole is a stirring reminder that throughout the American continent's many colonial wars, some native tribes never stopped fighting, never surrendered, and to this day, still inhabit the very same land as their proud warrior ancestors. We always have more stories to tell, so make sure you are.
That's pretty good. Again, I'm not trying to take sides when I'm just putting stuff out. I'm just trying to make it easier for people to kind of see both sides. And I totally respect the ones that stayed and now they number 4,000. Florida Seminoles, you know, the college named after them. Well, I don't think purchasing the Hard Rock is going to get you as far as you think, but hey, I've been there. I was there a long time ago though. I was there in the late 90s in St. Louis. But anyways, this is a good video. I talked a little bit too much. I apologize for that. So I'm going to go ahead and end it here. Like and subscribe, or words.